The case of Lisa Cecilia Harnum, the fiancé of a tyrant who turned a luxury apartment into a prison. Controlling behavior in couple relationships, unfortunately, is not uncommon and quite dangerous. It manifests itself when a person tries to subjugate and forcibly adapt their other half to their own needs through intimidation, demonstrations of strength and power, as well as humiliation and total control. Often the victim, because of the instilled feelings of fear and guilt, does not realize that he or she is in a destructive situation. The story of a young woman named Lisa Cecilia Harnum illustrates what a relationship with a control freak can lead to. She naively believed that she had met the love of her life, but she herself did not notice how her fiancé became a monster who turned their luxurious apartment into a real prison with 24-hour video surveillance. This case provoked an international scandal and was widely covered in the press. The unfortunate Lisa tried to make Lisa look mentally unstable and cold-blooded crime to pass off as an accident or voluntary resignation from life. However, the perpetrator, despite his money and connections, did not manage to escape responsibility. Now let's understand how her beloved man turned into a monster who hid his inhuman attitude behind care. Lisa Cecilia Harnum, biography, family, early years. Our today's heroine was born in Canada on June 12, 1981, in the suburbs of Toronto, and was the second child in the family. Lisa was brought up together with her older brother Jason, with whom she has always been very close. They were raised independently by single mom Joanna. Brother and sister did not remember their father because he left the family when the children were very young and no longer took any part in their lives. Lisa Cecilia grew up as an active and purposeful girl. From an early age, she was involved in sports. Together with her brother, went to the martial arts section, liked to play soccer and volleyball. But her main passion has always been ballet. She daily visited the dance studio where she practiced at the bar for several hours. The girl from childhood was tall and slender, but professional ballet classes required the strictest diet, which had a detrimental effect on the growing body. In adolescence, Lisa developed anorexia on the background of eating disorders. For a long time, she kept silent about her problem, believing that she could cope with everything herself. But when her weight approached critically low values, her mother sounded the alarm and put her daughter in the clinic, where Lisa needed to spend several months to restore health and weight gain. After graduating from school, the girl continued dancing classes and also decided to connect her life with the beauty industry. In parallel with her university studies, she got a job as a perfumer in one of the stores of a large cosmetics chain, and in her spare time, she studied the subtleties of makeup and hairdressing, moving to Australia. In 2005, having celebrated her 24th birthday, Lisa decided to make drastic changes in her life. She wanted to go to the other side of the world, to Australia, and there were several reasons for that. Firstly, she wanted to live in a warmer and milder climate, and secondly, Lisa wanted to see the world. She took a one-year work visa and traveled to another continent. However, with her then flew Joanna, who accompanied her daughter for the first few months to make sure that she was all right, and she settled well in the new place. The mother then returned back to Toronto with peace of mind, making sure her daughter could take care of herself. Lisa settled in Sydney, where she rented a cozy apartment and soon got a job at a local small cosmetology company. After her visa expired, she decided to move to Australia permanently. First, she extended her stay for another year and then began to prepare the necessary documents to obtain citizenship of this country. Personal life. As for personal life, in this respect, everything was not easy. The fact is that Lisa always preferred to meet with older men. Obviously, not the least role in this played a lack of a father in the family, so she always reached out to more mature men, looking for support and protection in them. In 2006, Lisa successfully interviewed for a job at Sydney Cosmetics and was hired. She soon began in a romantic relationship with a co-worker who was almost twice her age. A few months later, they decided to start living together, and Lisa moved into the apartment of her lover. And after a couple more months, the girl introduced her boyfriend to her mom and brother, and they approved her choice. The couple traveled a lot around the world, rested in the Seychelles in Paris, and also visited the famous carnival in Rio de Janeiro. The man even made Lisa a marriage proposal, which she gladly accepted. But about a year after the engagement, the lovers broke up. Lisa did not go into detail about the reasons for this decision, but hinted that too great a difference in age, however, played in this not the least role. In 2010, Lisa graduated from the Sydney College of Stylists and got a job as a hairdresser in a popular beauty salon, where she quickly won the respect of colleagues and the trust of customers. At the same time, a new boyfriend appeared in her life, but their romance did not last long because Lisa found out that he was married. Destroy someone else's family she was not going to, so she quickly broke off the relationship. But shortly before that, at one of the parties, this guy introduced her friend, a businessman named Simon Gittany. This acquaintance turned out to be fatal for Lisa. Who is Simon Gittany? Simon was born in Maryland in December 1973 in a very religious, large family of immigrants from Lebanon. He had 5 other siblings, whom his parents raised in strictness and obedience. However, Simon from a young age had problems with controlling emotions and outbursts of anger, and he was also possessive, did not tolerate rejection, and often gave the will of his fists. All this eventually led to serious problems with the law. The first time Gittany was behind bars was at the age of 18, when he came to his ex-girlfriend in the store where she worked and began to openly molest her. The store owner interceded for the girl and threw the impudent man out the door, but Simon returned with friends who grabbed the store owner and held him, while Simon beat him severely. That time, the guy only served a few months and was released on bail for good behavior afterwards. But 3 years later, he was arrested again, this time on theft charges. However, Simon resisted violently, threw himself into a fight, and bit off one of the policeman's earlobe. He was threatened with a serious prison sentence for this prank, but the pastor of the Lebanese Christian church, of which his entire family was members, interceded. As a result, the young man spent only a year and a half in prison. In 2000, Simon again came to the attention of the police, and this time he was arrested for possession and distribution of illegal substances. But the sentence was again extremely lenient, and he served 2 years out of the 4 assigned to him. On release, Gittany, as it seemed to everyone, took the path of correction. He moved to Sydney, where with a few friends founded a fairly successful business for the production and sale of luxury women's shoes. This business brought a stable high income, so Simon quickly became rich, acquired luxury real estate in a prestigious neighborhood, a premium class car, and carefully tried to hide from everyone his rich criminal past. From his roommates to his lovers. At that party, Simon and Lisa exchanged phone numbers, and soon he called her himself. Their relaxed communication somehow imperceptibly grew into a buddy relationship, and when in January 2010 Lisa complained that she was unhappy with her current living conditions and would like to rent an apartment in another neighborhood, Gittany kindly offered her to live for free in one of the rooms of his luxurious apartment while she was looking for a suitable place to rent. Lisa accepted the offer, although her mother was somewhat alarmed by this turn of events. But Lisa convinced Joanna that it was a temporary measure and that she and Simon are just friends. By the way, she herself at that time thought that the man who so carefully monitors his appearance and adores piercings preferred to build relationships with guys. But this opinion turned out to be wrong. For the first couple of months, Gittany really kept his distance. The young people lived in separate rooms, and there was not even a hint of intimacy or romance between them. But gradually they got closer, the so-called spark, and started a romance which quickly gained momentum. At the time of the beginning of their relationship, Simon was 37 years old, and Lisa, 28. Simon seemed to her a beautiful prince from a fairy tale. He was sociable, cheerful, spoiled his beloved with gifts, and arranged her pleasant surprises. The couple began to appear everywhere together. In particular, they went together to an elite sports club, which Simon attended regularly for many years. Lisa was sure that finally met her true love and would live a long, happy life with the chosen one. She raved about him to her mother, brother, and friends, and had no idea that this fairy tale would soon end. An affectionate tyrant. Just 6 months after the beginning of the relationship, Simon's behavior began to change, but it happened in stages and in such a way that Lisa did not notice anything, thinking that the lover does everything for her own good. He gradually distanced Lisa from friends and family, erased all her personal boundaries, tried to change her views, tastes, and behavior, adjusting them to his needs. In June 2010, shortly after Lisa celebrated her 29th birthday, Simon began to persistently persuade her to quit her job, claiming that she was not valued there and she could find a better paid position. But Lisa loved working at the beauty salon, where she had many regular clients and was happy with her income, so she didn't understand why she should quit her job and refused to do so. Simon was not satisfied with the refusal, and in August of the same year, he showed up at Lisa's salon, having thrown a loud scandal, which actually forced her to write a letter of resignation. Lisa Harnum was shocked by his behavior, but Gittany assured that it would be better, and in general, she can no longer work, because his income will allow them both to live comfortably, nothing to deny themselves. A month and a half later, the couple moved into a new luxury apartment, located on the 15th floor of an elite residential complex. As it later turned out, the room was literally stuffed with hidden surveillance cameras, of which Lisa, of course, did not even guess. Simon gave his beloved an expensive smartphone and laptop, pre-installed on them spyware that allowed him to track all her messages, emails, as well as listen to calls and see all of Lisa's movements. In addition, Simon gained access to her social media accounts and began to discreetly clean lists of friends, delete posts and photos at his discretion, as well as read personal correspondence. Total control. Gittany's control over Lisa increased day by day, but as an experienced manipulator, he made it look as if his girlfriend wanted to do as he told her. Gittany had invaded literally every aspect of her life, leaving no hint of privacy. He forbade Lisa to use cosmetics, claiming that she does too bright makeup, which makes her look vulgar. He also bought her clothes and unsightly clothes in gray and black colors, and all her outfits simply threw away, arguing that they were too revealing, and men would stare at her. From the apartment, Lisa went out only accompanied by her lover. They visited together only those places that he himself chose. Simon even forbade her to visit the gym. Instead, he bought several expensive exercise machines, saying that now she could train at home. Lisa's social media friend lists were dwindling by the day, and eventually Gittany convinced her to delete the accounts. Lisa also had no friends left in real life, and all her contacts and calls were closely monitored. Simon only allowed her to communicate with her mother and brother. Last trip home. In December 2010, Lisa decided to fly to Canada to celebrate Christmas with her family. Simon was going to fly with her, but at the last moment his plans were disrupted because of urgent business matters. He didn't plan to let his friend go alone, but she literally begged him, because she hadn't seen her mom and brother for over a year. In the end, he agreed, but set strict conditions and rules, which she had to strictly follow. Jason and Joanna were shocked at the changes that had happened to Lisa over the past year. She was nothing like the bright and cheerful beauty she had been before. She had literally become her own shadow. There was not a drop of makeup on her face. Her luxurious hair was pulled into a ponytail and hidden under a headdress. Her clothes were baggy, unattractive, and completely black. But it wasn't even the outward changes that were the most frightening. Lisa flinched every time the phone rang and instantly grabbed the receiver. It was one of Simon's conditions. She had to answer immediately, at any time of day, no matter what she was doing at that moment. Lisa stayed at her mother's house all the time, refused to see her friends, and hardly ever went out. Joanna was alarmed and frightened by this behavior of her daughter, and she decided to have a heart-to-heart talk with her. Then Lisa burst into tears and admitted that Simon always knows where she is, with whom she communicates, and what she talks about on the phone. Lisa also revealed that Simon doesn't allow her to work, see her friends, go to the gym, or have any hobbies. In fact, she had no friends left at all. Her mother was shocked. She began to persuade her daughter to stay in Canada, because in Australia she has nothing to keep her. But Lisa said that she loved Simon and did not want to break off the relationship with him. Lisa was sure that this is just a transitional period in their relationship because they have been together for less than a year, and soon he will calm down and loosen his grip. She also added that her lover cares about her and wishes her only good. Despite pleas from her family to stay and attempts to convince Lisa that their relationship was unhealthy, she decided to move back to Australia to stay with Gittany. Lisa reassured her mother, saying that there was nothing to worry about and that Simon loved her and would not hurt her. Prisoner. After Lisa returned, the situation only got worse. Simon forbade her to leave the apartment, and if they went out together, she had to look only at her feet so as not to meet the eyes of other men. Moreover, Simon began to call Lisa by her second name, Cecilia, because it seemed more decent to him. In the spring of 2011, Lisa began to complain of pain in her leg. It was an old injury received in his youth during ballet classes. But instead of taking her to the hospital, Gittany hired a female physical therapist who came to their home 3 times a week to give her massages. She soon became Lisa's only friend and confidant, to whom Lisa spoke candidly about the difficult situation she found herself in. On June 12th, for Lisa's 30th birthday, Simon decided to throw a party at the most expensive restaurant in Sydney, but among the guests were only Simon's relatives and people from his inner circle. Lisa, on her own birthday, boyfriend did not allow to invite anyone. At the end of the evening, Simon proposed to Lisa by putting a ring on her finger. Harnum responded with consent and then cried, but all present noticed that these were not tears of joy, but rather tears of despair and hopelessness. Back home, Lisa called her mother and informed her of her engagement, sobbing into the phone. But Joanna was not at all happy about it. She began to persuade her daughter to leave this man and, as soon as possible, to return home to Canada. In response, Lisa only asked her mother never to start such conversations on the phone. At that moment, she already realized that the fiancé was listening to the calls, although she did not know for sure. Escape plan. For a while, Lisa tried to distract herself with thoughts of the upcoming wedding and began planning the festivities. When she decided to consult with Simon about something related to the event, he rudely cut her off and told her that he would choose the place, buy her address, and make the guest list. Lisa was utterly crushed, for she had no say even here. During another visit to the physiotherapist, Lisa admitted that she couldn't go on like this, but she couldn't leave because her fiancé wouldn't let her go. Together, they developed a plan according to which Lisa, at each visit of the masseuse, gave her some of her belongings for safekeeping, but did everything so that Simon did not notice anything. On July 28th, Simon left his laptop at home in a hurry, which he usually carried with him everywhere. Lisa took advantage of this and looked into it, and her worst fears were realized. There she found a spyware program, with the help of which the fiancé received all the data from her phone, as well as numerous recordings of her conversations with her mother. But the most horrifying discovery was the surveillance footage from the security cameras located in every room of their apartment. That same day, Lisa, using her physical therapist's phone, called her mother and asked her to come on the next flight to her apartment and take her home. However, Joanna could not leave work so quickly. She needed time to ask for an excuse to switch shifts with one of her colleagues. Afterwards, the woman could never forgive herself for this delay. Back home, Simon immediately realized that his fiancée had taken his laptop and seen the spyware. Lisa cried, trying to figure out why she deserved to be treated that way, but Simon only pointed out that he'd done it for her own good. Accident or murder? The next day, July 29th, a serious conversation took place between the young people, the recording of which was later presented in court. Lisa was in tears and asked to go home, but Gittany calmly and confidently said that this would never happen, asked Lisa to calm down, and claimed that she had mental problems. On the morning of July 30th, 2011, Lisa got up early, got fully dressed, and put her documents and essentials in her purse. She locked herself in the bathroom and called her mother one last time, telling her that if anything happened to her, it would be Simon's fault. Apparently, Lisa wanted to leave the apartment unnoticed while her fiancé slept, but she failed. What happened next can only be guessed. According to neighbors, they heard a scream in the hallway, but did not have time to react because all abruptly hushed. And exactly a minute later, a young woman fell from the balcony of the 15th floor, crashing to her death. Several passers-by on the street also heard the scream and saw a body falling from a height, but did not have time to realize what was happening. According to a guy who was walking his dog that morning and was closest to the scene, he heard a noise and looked up. The eyewitness saw a man holding something large, which he then threw down. When passers-by came to the place of the fall, they saw a young woman lying on the ground, but all attempts to help her were in vain, as she died instantly, having received extensive injuries. 3 minutes later, Gittany, dressed in his pajamas, ran out into the street. He was crying, saying he didn't know how he was going to live his life, and claiming that he hadn't caught his fiancé in time. At first glance, it looked like an accident, but Simon himself was quick to claim that his fiancé had voluntarily passed away. A note in his pocket and a frightening video. Strange things began as soon as the body was taken to the morgue and examined. In different pockets were found fragments of a note torn into small pieces with the text, "There are cameras everywhere in the apartment." Probably Lisa was afraid that Simon might find the message, so she turned the note into a kind of garbage and scattered it in different pockets. A check showed that there were indeed a lot of cameras in the apartment, but the hard disk with recordings could not be found, and Simon claimed that there was no video recording at all. A surveillance camera in the communal hallway, on the other hand, captured something frightening. The short clip shows Lisa running out of the apartment and calling for help, but her fiancé grabs her from behind, covers her mouth, and drags her back in. This happened a minute before she fell off the balcony, and it was this scream that the neighbors heard. And Gittany's laptop was found to contain a recording of a conversation he and Lisa had the night before the tragedy, as well as spyware that Simon used to spy on his fiancée. According to Simon, he and Lisa had an argument that morning, and she became hysterical. She ran out into the hallway screaming, but he brought her back because he didn't want to put on a show for the neighbors. In the apartment, he picked up the phone to call her mother, but Lisa ran out to the balcony at that moment and threw herself down, and he ran after her but did not catch her in time. He claimed that she had threatened to take her own life before, but he didn't take her words seriously. But Gittany attributed the spy program to his concern for his fiancé's safety. Trial and sentencing. In the course of the trial, Simon was accompanied by already a new pasta, 22-year-old model Rachel Louise, who was just incredibly similar to his dead fiancé. However, later it was said that the girl just wanted to become famous at the expense of this high-profile case, and therefore willingly talked to the press and appeared on television, saying that Gittany would never raise his hand on a woman. Simon's lawyers tried to convince the court that Lisa suffered from a mental disorder, was prone to hysterics, and could have voluntarily passed away. Even a long history of anorexia and treatment in a clinic came up. The defense also argued that the defendant, being short in stature, simply could not physically lift Lisa, who was taller than him, and also could not throw her off the balcony. But this version was refuted by a trainer from the gym, which Simon had attended regularly for many years. According to the trainer, the defendant worked with heavy weights, was much stronger than he appeared outwardly, and could easily have lifted Lisa. This was also supported by the absence of Lisa's fingerprints on the railing and the glass barrier, as she could not have jumped without leaning on them. Also testifying in court was the physiotherapist to whom Lisa had told in detail everything that had happened to her and had given her her belongings in the hope of escaping from the tyrant. It was her testimony that was decisive. Gittany was found guilty of murdering his fiancée and sentenced to 26 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 years. After the verdict was announced, Rachel Louise threw a tantrum and began to insult the judge, for which she was removed from the room. All attempts by Simon and his lawyers to challenge the court's decision were rejected, and the verdict remained in force. Rachel soon dumped her boyfriend, saying in an interview that it was difficult for them to maintain a relationship in prison, but she remains convinced of his innocence. At the western end of Algoa Bay, stretching along the southeastern coast of South Africa, 400 miles from Cape Town, is the city of Port Elizabeth. In addition to being a major seaport, it is also the 6th most populous city in South Africa. It is in this city, in November 2004, 18-year-old Panayiotou graduated from high school and joined the trading corporation of his father, who owned a fairly large network of stores and eateries in the city and its surroundings. Chris had a desire to be involved in his father's business from a young age and developed an interest in the specifics of managing retail chains and how to develop the retail services industry. He possessed amazing energy and determination. His dreams extended far beyond being an executive and skillful employee under his father's supervision. He dreamed of owning his own fish restaurant, somewhere near a 5-star hotel along Marina Drive and a large supermarket right by downtown Kings Beach. That afternoon, he was helping his father at a small diner on Market Street. The establishment's 1-story-old building lacked square footage and glamour, but it was nonetheless popular with the neighborhood's youth. Here, Chris Panayiotou met his high school friend who invited him to a Friday night party organized by mutual friends at Barty's Tavern, located on the beach, and a constant success among young people. On Friday, sitting in a wicker bamboo chair and sipping beer from the establishment's specialty mug, Chris noticed a pretty young girl sitting alone at the bar, drinking lemonade from a tall glass. The young man left his seat and walked over to meet her. Her name was Jayde Dinks, and she had just turned 18 years old as well. A spark immediately ran between them. The young people found many common interests very quickly. After that party, Chris and Jayde began dating, not even realizing that their Friday night meeting at Barney's Tavern would be the prelude to a horrible love triangle story that would lead to a tragic death. Jayde was a girl with a cheerful and sweet personality. Her endless thirst for giving joy and warmth to others inspired her to devote herself to teaching. In 2005, she enrolled in university. While Jayde focused on her studies, Chris started his own business with tenacity and entrepreneurial spirit. The first business was a local grocery store, then a neighborhood restaurant and a cocktail bar, which Chris named Infinite. Despite the young people's busyness, the feelings that bonded Jayde and Chris grew stronger. It was a period when their relationship was growing stronger, like the roots of a young tree penetrating deeper into the soil. Both Jayde and Chris created their own little corner of happiness, where kindness and love seemed eternal, and days were filled with smiles and hope for an endlessly joyful future. However, over time, the lovers began to have problems in their relationship, or rather, one female problem. At first, Chanel Coutus was an employee of the store. She maintained with her employer, Chris Panayiotou, only business relations. But everything changed after a year. Among the office corridors and long store windows, secret love between Chris and his employee, Chanel Coutus, blossomed imperceptibly, and this woman became not just an employee of the store, but also Chris's lover. All, of course, carefully concealed. But employees, working next to this couple, could not help but notice the delicate hints of their affection for each other. Glances, enigmatic smiles, and gentle gestures left behind an aura of mystery and some hint. The lovers met secretly at night in local cozy hotels, and when Jayde was away, Chris even brought Chanel to his home. By this time, in the eyes of family and friends, Jayde and Chris looked like an established young couple. They were very well suited for each other and seemed successful and promising. Jayde had graduated from university and got a job at an elementary school on Nelson Mandela Bay, and Chris's business was doing well. Finally, they were officially engaged and began living together. Nevertheless, Chris's connection with Chanel continued. Chris's father, Costa Panayiotou, was terribly upset on the one hand and furious on the other with the unexpected news of his son's secret affair with a sales clerk. He could not understand how Chris, dating the intelligent, kind, and decent Jayde for 8 years, on the eve of the wedding, could behave so immorally. Costa found his son at Infinite celebrating his engagement with friends. That's where the heated conversation took place. Costa promised to disinherit Chris if he continued to date Chanel. Chris vowed to his father that he would leave Chanel, but in fact, continued his affair with Coutus. All this time, Jayde had no idea about her fiancé's affairs on the side. Therefore, Chris and Jayde were safely married in 2012. Soon, Jayde received an invitation to work at Rebecca College. Chris, spending serious money to support 2 women, gave his business its first blow. His finances dropped significantly. Expensive gifts to his mistress, spending on fancy hotel rooms, and treats all did not add to the profitability of the business. Over the next 3 years, Chris became increasingly estranged from his wife. Continuing his affair on the side, thus destroying his business and family. Jayde felt that there was loneliness in her life and that Chris had her on the back burner with no time to pay attention to her. The young woman shared with her friends a heavy sense of disappointment in her relationship with her husband. All her efforts to restore the former harmony did not lead to anything. Realizing the futility of her actions, by September 2014, Jayde realized that she was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. On September 21st, she decided to address herself by writing a letter in which she shared her deep feelings. In the letter, Jayde clearly expresses her desire to be loved and have a normal marriage. She emotionally expressed her feelings and experiences of wanting to be loved by her husband and her desire for close, warm relationships and support. She longed for a normal man who would take care of her and with whom she could build a healthy relationship. Jayde expressed in her frank letter her frustration and dissatisfaction with her husband's behavior of hiding things from her. This caused her to feel a sense of distrust and uncertainty. She described her state as if her heart had been taken from her and it had been torn and trampled. Jayde also expressed a desire to spend more time around her husband. In the early spring morning of April 20th, 2015, a Monday, a rented car with 3 stout guys inside stopped near the gate of Staring Gled Village where the young Panayiotou couple lived. Their attention was drawn to a fashionably dressed young woman who was impatiently waiting for someone standing by the roadside. 2 of the trio had already started to open the car doors to get out of the car when the driver, who was left behind the wheel, gave them a command to stay in their seats. They watched through the tinted glass of their car as a black BMW parked beside her. She settled into the back seat and the car sped past them, picking up speed. The driver annoyingly slapped his hands on the steering wheel. The next morning, Tuesday at 6:15, Jayde Panayiotou left the house as usual to go to work at the college. It was no more than a 40-minute drive to her place of work, and she was waiting for her friend and co-worker Cheryl in her BMW to go there. She glanced absent-mindedly at the curb where she spotted yesterday's car with tinted windows. Cheryl was running late. Jayde pulled her cell phone out of her purse with the intention of calling her friend. In her sideways vision, she saw 2 figures coming toward her from the roadside bushes. Cheryl was only 10 minutes late, but Jayde wasn't at her usual spot. Cheryl had called her phone in vain, and calls to the door of the house were also fruitless. The college also confirmed Jayde's absence from work. Anxiety rose in Cheryl's heart, and she called the police. By 10 o'clock in the morning, Jayde Panayiotou was announced missing to the media and social media. On the same day, the search for the missing young woman began. In addition to the police and a special canine unit, volunteers from the local community took part in the search. Night fell, but unfortunately there were still no results. In the morning, the search resumed. A reward was announced for any information about Jayde, then the amount increased. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a canine officer with his dog named Angel discovered the body of Jayde Panayiotou in a bushy ravine near Bushley. She was fully clothed. The medical examiner found 2 gunshot wounds in her back and 1 shot to the head. Her bank cards and jewelry were gone, as if someone had tried to obfuscate the motives for the murder. It wasn't just an act of violence, it was a low, inhumane act. Who would take the life of such a kind and harmless person? Jayde's family was in shock. Family and friends couldn't believe this could have happened. Jayde's students and co-workers were also grieving. The heartache of the terrible tragedy spread like waves in the ocean, far and wide across the country. Social media buzzed with grief and bewilderment. Who could have committed such a despicable and senseless murder? On October 22nd, Jayde's family held a memorial service at the Catholic Church, and a funeral was held, attended by an unimaginable number of Port Elizabeth residents. So tragic and ridiculous was the young woman's death that it struck the citizens of the city and echoed with pain and compassion in their hearts. Among the family and friends of the deceased were also Jayde's students and colleagues who came to pay their respects and mourn the young teacher. But apart from people who knew Jayde Panayiotou closely, the city cemetery was attended by operatives of the South African Police Service, whose attention was drawn to the strange behavior of the deceased's husband, Chris. The young businessman's grief looked rather fake. But most of all, The investigative team was surprised by the obviously staged farewell speech of the widower. Having checked its text through search engines on the internet, the police found an incredible similarity of Chris's epitaph with the dedication of Charles Atkins to his late wife. Of course, it was not a direct evidence, but the police officers had a suspicion about Chris Panayiotou's involvement in the tragic death of his wife. They decided to keep a close eye on him. In addition, several other suspicious facts pointed to Chris's participation in the murder of his wife. On the eve of the funeral, on the tip-off of special agents, the police arrested on suspicion of possible participation in this atrocious crime one Latonda Seon, who turned out to be a security guard at Chris Panayiotou's nightclub. The man gave statements indicating that Chris had approached him to hire killers for his wife, and that he, Latonda Seon, had found him 3 of his friends. Police also learned that on the day of Jayde's murder, someone tried to use her bank cards twice. After examining bank surveillance tapes, detectives found images of 2 men who Latonda Seon identified as his hired killers. Latonda actively cooperated with law enforcement, and they decided to release him from custody on the condition that he complete the task of gathering evidence and Chris's confession to his wife's murder. For this, the authorities promised to commute Latonda Seon's sentence. Following instructions from the police, Latonda called Chris and summoned him for a confidential conversation, which was recorded with special equipment. In it, Panayiotou revealed himself fully, which allowed the investigation to arrest Chris at night, 2 hours after the telephone conversation with Latonda. Soon, based on the detailed testimony of the detainee, 3 more suspects were arrested. After that, the picture of the crime was completely reconstructed by days, hours, and minutes. Chris ordered the hitmen to kill his wife, Jayde Panayiotou, on the morning of April 20th, 2015, when she would be waiting at 6:30 a.m. for her co-worker Cheryl in a car that would take her to work. However, on this day, the perpetrators had a setback. Cheryl arrived to pick up Jayde in her car a little early to save her friend's life on that spring April morning. The killers were forced to reschedule the execution of the order for the next day, which proved more fortunate for them. On April 21st, Jayde appeared outside the gates of her community at 6:15 a.m., and the 3 criminals were already there, 2 of them in an ambush, not far from where Jayde usually waited for her colleague. Now the killers changed their plan. They did not kill Jayde near the housing estate, but decided to kidnap her, take her to another place, and execute their vile plans there. Jayde had no time to actively resist, so swift and unexpected was the attack. The 2 men grabbed Jayde firmly from both sides under her arms, depriving her of maneuverability, and threw her roughly into the back seat of a speeding car. The young woman was so shocked that she didn't even scream or resist. The 2 kidnappers were sitting on either side of her, and there was no way to get out of the speeding car. Jayde tried to offer the criminals money, but they had other things on their minds. After 30 minutes of fast driving, the car pulled off the dirt road into the woods northwest of the village. They led the young woman to a small ravine, and each fired a revolver once. The men then took the valuables and jewelry in cold blood and threw the body into a small ravine, hastily covering it with brushwood. The criminals then drove to a nearby ATM and withdrew $100 using the murdered woman's bank card. On the same day, they tried to withdraw cash again, but due to an incorrectly entered PIN code, the payment was not executed. Both withdrawal attempts were recorded by surveillance cameras. On October 11, 2015, the trial against Chris and the 2 mercenaries began and generated unprecedented interest throughout the country. The case was covered in all media with detailed details. The prosecution argued that the motive for the murder was financial debt and difficulties in supporting 2 women, Chris's wife and mistress. The trial revealed the key points of the case. Chanel Kutis, Chris's mistress, took the witness stand to testify about the lavish gifts Chris gave her. Her testimony also confirmed that she slept over with Chris when his wife Jayde was away and described their passionate nights at various hotels in the city. Various pieces of evidence were presented in court, such as records of calls between the hired killers and the bouncer of the Latonda Seon nightclub, ATM videos, and pictures confirming withdrawals, GPS coordinates of the location of the hidden car, and other evidence that pointed to the defendant's involvement in the murder. The court discussed the financial situation of Chris, who appeared to be having difficulty supporting both women. This created a motive to get rid of one of them. The mysterious death of the third defendant just before the trial began added to the mystery of the case. He may have been an important witness for the prosecution, or may have had information that could have been even more damaging to Chris and his co-defendants. The court concluded that there was sufficient evidence to support the involvement of Chris and the mercenaries in the murder. Their motivation was related to the financial problems and life difficulties of Chris, who decided that getting rid of one of the women would be the solution to his problems. Jayde's story is a true tragedy. Her life was too short and full of injustice. All the witnesses called by the court described Jayde as a kind and devoted woman. Her death was a loss to all who knew and loved her. The court clearly concluded that Chris killed his wife out of greed to avoid financial problems. This motive makes his act even more inhumane and cruel. Chris's actions show how some people can go to extreme lengths for their own gain. Chris, as well as the two hired killers, received a life sentence. This is a just punishment for such a horrible crime. Litancioni had yet to be fully sentenced because he went to cooperate with law enforcement. However, there are still some mysterious and unexpected 6 moments in this tragic story. The tragic death of Chris's father, Jayde Panayiotou, on December 9, 2019, added more mystery and grief for the already existing tragedy. Chris's affair with a store worker and Jayde Panayiotou's unwillingness to accept this choice of his son could have been a source of family conflict and tension. It is not yet clear who killed Jayde Panayiotou and why. This horrific crime leaves many unanswered questions and adds an element of mystery to an already complicated situation. The situation of Chris Panayiotou, who put his own interests and desires above the life and well-being of his wife and family, is one of intense outrage and condemnation. If his actions were related to the death of his father, it would add even more complexity to an already horrible situation. If Chris Panayiotou had anything to do with his father's death, he should be punished for yet another crime. Either way, this horrible man now will never go free. Greed, envy, and the desire to get wealth without much effort often push people to commit the most heinous and cynical crimes. Sometimes it is hard to imagine what cruelty a person is capable of for the sake of quick enrichment, for example, the murder of a close relative. The story of Elizabeth Vasquez is truly shocking and horrifying. This kind and hard-working woman all her life worked for the good of her family, striving to give her beloved daughter all the best, including a good education. But the greedy heiress, along with her boyfriend, did the unthinkable. This complex case for several years stirred the press and shocked the public with its inhumanity, showing how a young woman can easily decide to kill her own mother. Let's try to understand how in a prosperous and well-to-do family grew a real monster, devoid of any feelings of pity, remorse, or conscience. The large and happy Vasquez family. In 1967, in the town of Cajamarca in northwestern Peru, a girl named Elizabeth Lillian Vasquez Movilla was born. She was the oldest of 6 children in the family of Ernesto Vasquez and Maria Movilla. Her parents were hard-working, simple people who worked hard to provide for their many offspring, give them an education and a chance at a better life. The Vasquez family was friendly and very happy, and from an early age, Elizabeth helped her mother take care of her younger siblings. She was an excellent student and graduated from school with honors, which allowed her to easily enter the prestigious university at the Faculty of Law and Economics. While at the university, she met a young man named Alejandro Mendez Espino, who was also studying law and was known as one of the top students in his class. A romantic relationship quickly developed between the two, which grew rapidly, and they were officially married in 1987, even before graduating from university. Elizabeth's parents approved of her choice from the very beginning and gladly accepted her son-in-law into the family. Alejandro was a serious, intelligent, ambitious, and very purposeful man who could take good care of their eldest daughter. At first, the newlyweds lived in the Vasquez family home, but after 6 months, when Elizabeth became pregnant, they decided to move into their separate home. Only daughter. Approximately a year after their marriage in 1988, the couple welcomed their only joint heir, whom they named after the mother, Elizabeth Vasquez Espino. Affectionately called Elita in the family, the girl became the center of attention for all her numerous relatives and the main joy of her parents. Several years after the birth of their daughter, the couple, whose careers were steadily ascending, decided to move to Peru's capital, Lima. By then, Alejandro was vying for a prosecutor position in an anti-corruption department, while Elizabeth had opened her own legal consulting firm. Both worked tirelessly for the benefit of their family, but unfortunately couldn't spend enough time with their young daughter. Confronted with an unsatisfactory experience hiring a nanny who didn't fulfill her duties conscientiously, the young mother decided to send her daughter to her parents in Cajamarca for them to take care of the heiress. Maria and Ernesto readily agreed and were overjoyed to have their granddaughter live with them for a while. Notably, their youngest daughter, Giovanna, Elita's aunt, was only a couple of years older than Elita, so they immediately got along and interacted like real sisters. Due to their total commitment to work, the parents rarely saw their daughter and compensated by showering her with gifts during visits. Elita's stay at her grandparents' home stretched over several years, and when her parents decided to bring her back to their home in Lima, she had already started school. It's worth noting that the abrupt change in environment did not benefit the girl, and she took quite some time to adapt to life in the bustling, noisy capital after the quiet, almost provincial Cajamarca. The challenging parent-daughter relationship. As a child, Elita was a quiet and well-behaved kid. She strove to excel academically, engaging in music and foreign languages. She shared a warm and trusting relationship with her parents, who tried to compensate for the years of enforced separation. Elizabeth aimed to be not just a mother, but also Elita's best friend, someone she could share her deepest thoughts with. This remained true until Elita turned 15. During her teenage years, Elita's character deteriorated rapidly. She became rude, threw tantrums, and stopped listening to her parents. She abandoned her studies, got involved with bad company, and worst of all, began stealing money from her parents' wallets. Elizabeth tried various approaches to connect with her daughter, hoping it was just a phase that Elita would outgrow. However, the girl regularly instigated heated arguments with her mother, ending in hysterics and tears. During these moments, Alejandro typically remained neutral, but if Elita sought his intervention, he often took her side. Elita was deeply hurt and offended by being constantly compared to her smart, beautiful, successful, and hard-working mother. Next to Elizabeth, Elita indeed appeared as the ugly duckling, being the complete opposite of her mother in every aspect. She lacked striking looks, was overweight, lazy, and temperamental, often lied, and didn't shy away from theft. Elita harbored numerous complexes about her appearance. When she expressed a desire for plastic surgery, Elizabeth, eager to please her daughter and mend their relationship, didn't dissuade her. Elizabeth financed an initial rhinoplasty for her daughter, and a few years later, several more surgeries. In 2007, after 20 years of marriage, Alejandro and Elizabeth decided to separate. Their 18-year-old daughter reacted with a hysterical outburst, screaming, insulting, and blaming her mother for driving her father away. At the time, the family was in the United States, and the divorce posed some complications for citizens of another country. Nonetheless, they returned home as divorced individuals and began living separately. By mutual agreement, the now adult but still dependent daughter stayed in her mother's house. They continued to have fierce arguments, and during such moments, Elita would call her father, crying and begging him to take her in. However, Alejandro, who had moved on with a new love, was not eager to do so. He always convinced Elita to reconcile with her mother and wait a bit longer until she finished university and started an independent life. Despite her plummeting academic performance, terrible character, and provocative behavior, Elita's parents ensured she enrolled in the law faculty of one of Peru's most prestigious universities. The education was costly, but her father and mother decided not to skimp on the education of their only child. Elita's unreliable boyfriend Elita had her fair share of teenage romances, but at 19, she fell genuinely in love for the first time. It all started one Sunday morning at church, where she met a charming young man named Fernando Gonzalez. He couldn't take his eyes off her during the service, and afterward, He approached her to introduce himself. To Alita, Fernando seemed like a prince, handsome, attentive, with a pleasant voice. He invited her for coffee and a chat. As it turned out, he had a habit of scouting churches for young, well-dressed girls who arrived in luxury cars, then would strike up a conversation, charm them, and play on their sympathies. He'd spin tales about his difficult childhood in a large family abandoned by their father, how he was now supporting his mother, brothers and sisters by working multiple jobs. Wealthy and naive girls would sympathize and give him money. Sometimes he managed to maintain a wealthy girlfriend for a few months, but typically, they'd leave him once the truth was revealed. He was just an unemployed slacker who loved the high life. Alita fell easily into Fernando's trap due to her complexes. Always considering herself unattractive, she couldn't believe such a handsome man noticed her and was ready to give him everything she had, or rather, everything her mother had. She opened up to her mother about everything, leading to their first candid conversation in years. Elizabeth thought she had a chance to mend their relationship, especially since Alita had met the boy in church, which seemed promising, and assumed he must be a good person. Upon their first meeting, Fernando managed to make a positive impression on Elizabeth. He told her his dramatic life story, and she believed him, deciding that such a good boy deserved help. She rented a cozy apartment for him near central Lima, agreeing to pay 70% of the monthly rent. She also paid for his business school tuition, promising him a job in her company later on. It seemed that Fernando gratefully accepted her generosity, ready to start studying. However, he had no interest in attending boring lectures or working. He just wanted to have fun and spend someone else's money. He gladly moved into the rented apartment but never paid anything towards it, claiming to be broke and promising to pay back later. Soon it became clear that Fernando only attended a couple of business school classes before quitting. After a serious talk with Elizabeth, he seemed remorseful. She decided to give him a second chance and employed him as a courier in her company. On his very first day, he not only failed to complete a simple task, but also betrayed other employees who had entrusted him with important documents. Elizabeth finally realized that this young man had charmed her daughter only to leech off her for his own needs. He had no intentions of studying or working. She then forbade Alita from seeing him, which provoked her daughter's anger and resentment. Alita screamed and cried, accusing her mother of trying to ruin her life and take away her happiness. She refused to listen to reason and insisted she would continue seeing Fernando. Failed attempt to separate the couple. Elizabeth decided to send her daughter to her parents' home for a while, naively believing that if Alita didn't see her boyfriend for a few months, her feelings would cool down, and Fernando would find another rich fool to exploit. But Elizabeth was greatly mistaken. Alita continued to communicate with her boyfriend through calls and social media, and her resentment towards her mother only grew. Fernando had to move out of the rental apartment after Elizabeth refused to pay for it. However, he found a smaller place, rented for him by his young lover with her mother's money. Alita had some financial freedom, being a spoiled child, and could freely use some of her mother's accounts. When the summer break ended and university resumed, Alita immediately rushed to meet her boyfriend, who once again asked her for money. She withdrew a substantial amount from her mother's account and gave it to him, leading to a serious confrontation with her mother later that evening upon noticing the missing funds. Elizabeth then decided to block Alita's access to her accounts, giving her only a small weekly allowance for personal expenses. This decision further strained their already tense relationship. They barely spoke, mainly engaged in arguments, and Elizabeth's attempts to reach out to her daughter were unsuccessful. The monstrous plan. During one of their romantic dates, when Alita couldn't bring Fernando the money he demanded, he became furiously angry. He cursed Elizabeth, screaming that she had plenty of money but wouldn't give any to her only daughter, then added that if Elizabeth were gone, adult Alita would inherit all her wealth, and they could live luxuriously. This terrible idea took root in Alita's mind, growing stronger each day. She constantly talked about how much she hated her mother, blamed her for all her misfortunes, and fantasized about how wonderful it would be if her mother disappeared. The young lovers began to devise a monstrous and cynical plan to eliminate Vasquez, also considering whom they could involve as accomplices. At that time, Elizabeth had nearly $3 million in her accounts, owned a successful business that could be sold, a large house in an elite area of the capital, several cars, and her life was insured for a significant amount. In the event of her death, all of this would be inherited by her only child, Alita. Elizabeth seemed to sense danger. She realized she couldn't separate her daughter from the mercenary and deceitful young man who negatively influenced her. The situation was escalating and could resolve in the most unpredictable way. Being an experienced lawyer, Elizabeth drafted a will stating that in case of her sudden disappearance or untimely death, all money and property should go to Ernesto Vasquez, her father. She even managed to visit her parents and tell them about her decision. Meanwhile, Alita planned to stage the kidnapping and murder of her own mother by suspected criminals who would never be found. She and Fernando decided to involve a tough guy, Jorge Carnejo Ruiz, promising to pay him generously for his services. He accepted the offer without a second thought. A crime against his own mother. On January 24, 2010, 21-year-old Alita met with her 23-year-old boyfriend to finalize the plan for the crime that was to take place the next day. She was calm and collected, already envisioning how she would spend the millions she had inherited. The next morning, January 25th, citing ill health, Alita did not go to the university and stayed home. When her mother left for work, Fernando and Jorge were already lurking outside the house, waiting for Alita to distract the guard and sneak them inside. Alita approached the guard on duty and asked him to buy painkillers from the nearest pharmacy, which was only a 5-minute walk away. This brief absence allowed the young men to sneak into the house and hide in the master bedroom. When Elizabeth returned, Alita loudly dropped a glass in the kitchen, signaling her attackers to gather. When Elizabeth entered her room, Fernando knocked her to the ground and began choking her, with Jorge holding her down. Miraculously, Elizabeth managed to break free and run out into the hallway, where her own daughter kicked her in the head. While Elizabeth was unconscious, they tied her up. However, their plans were disrupted by a young servant girl, Maria Celine, whom Alita tricked into another room and locked her in. When Elizabeth regained consciousness, her daughter, boyfriend, and their accomplice brutally tortured her, trying to find out the code to the safe and passwords to her bank accounts. Terrified, Elizabeth knew her daughter was in trouble, but had always blamed it on Gonzalez's bad influence. Now, however, she saw the monstrous nature of her only daughter. Elizabeth managed to loosen the restraints and fought back against her daughter, scratching and punching her until Fernando knocked her to the ground. An enraged Alita kicked her mother and finally, in a fit of rage, grabbed a pillow and smothered her until she stopped showing signs of life. The trio then bound the lifeless body, duct taped her mouth shut, and placed Elizabeth in the trunk of her own car, staging a kidnapping. Alita then sent another guard to get medication, allowing her accomplices to drive off the property. She later freed a terrified Maria, falsely claiming that she and her mother had quarreled but made up, and that her mother had gone to bed. A strange story of a kidnapping and the search for a missing woman. In the morning, the maid was preparing breakfast as usual, but Alita came to the kitchen and told her that her mother had gone to work early because of an important meeting. After that, Alita left the house to go to her mother's workplace. There, she walked into the office of Jessica Hippo, her mother's best friend and accountant, and tearfully reported that her mother was missing and that she was receiving strange, threatening, and ransom calls. The accountant immediately started blocking the accounts to prevent the intruders from accessing them, reported the incident to the police, and left the office for a while. When she returned, Alita was gone and the office was in disarray, as if someone was looking for something. Later, it turned out that Elizabeth's will was missing, which Alita had learned about the day before by overhearing a telephone conversation. Using a key she had stolen from her mother, Alita had also taken a copy of the will and cash from the safe in her mother's study. Police arrived and inspected the house, interviewing the missing woman's daughter as well as the office staff, but gained no valuable information. All claimed that Vasquez had no enemies and no one had threatened her, so no one was initially listed as a suspect. The main theory was that it was a kidnapping for ransom. All that was left was to wait for a call from the criminals to receive further instructions and demands. A terrifying discovery and the first suspect. The day after Elizabeth's disappearance became known, it was reported that her car was found abandoned in a vacant lot outside of town. The interior was empty, but when law enforcement officers opened the trunk, they were shocked by what they found. Inside lay the lifeless body of a missing woman with signs of beatings. Forensic experts counted dozens of bruises, severe head trauma, and rope marks on the victim's body, indicating that the woman had been tied up and tried to free herself. It was also determined that Vasquez's death was caused by asphyxiation. Particles of blood and epithelium were found under her fingernails, indicating that she had resisted. It was now necessary to determine who the blood belonged to. At the lineup, Alita appeared as a grief-stricken daughter. She cried, wailed, and seemed almost unconscious. However, at the interrogation, she behaved quite differently. She was calm, even cold-blooded, and the questions of the investigators, she was visibly annoyed. In addition, she constantly contradicted herself in her testimony. When the police decided to check the information about the calls from the kidnappers and sent a request to the cell phone company, it turned out that Alita did not receive any calls. It also turned out that in the days before and after her mother's disappearance, Alita had been in frequent contact with one Fernando Gonzalez, who they also decided to question. However, the young man either insisted on his innocence or remained silent. Irrefutable evidence and an arrest. Elizabeth's maternal grandparents were in charge of her funeral, while Elizabeth herself was indifferent, thinking only about how to get out of the situation, stay free, and save money. She called her father, who was already aware of what had happened, and crying, told him of her innocence and asked for help. Her father advised her not to talk too much and promised to get her out of the situation, even though he knew perfectly well who had committed the crime. However, he did not want his daughter to go to prison because it would have cast a shadow of shame on Alejandro, who at the time held the high office of Justice of the Peace and President of the Supreme Court, and was a powerful and respected man. Meanwhile, forensic results showed that the blood and skin particles under the deceased's fingernails belonged to her daughter. Alita tried to claim that she had a serious quarrel with her mother, and they briefly quarreled, but then made up. However, no one believed her anymore. Further inspection of Elizabeth's room with special equipment revealed numerous wiped traces of blood throughout the house, including in Alita's room, despite her attempts to wipe away the evidence. Alita's story that she had an argument with her mother in the evening, but then made up, and the claim that her mother left early for work the next morning and was never seen again, quickly fell apart. She contradicted herself, first saying she had not gone into her mother's room, and then remembering that she had. The ransom calls were completely fabricated by her. The testimony of the maid Maria Chalan played a decisive role in the case. She told how on the night of the crime, Alita locked her in a room from where she heard Elizabeth's screams and sounds of struggle, but could not help. After that night, she never saw her employer again, and Alita insisted that everything was fine with her mother, who had simply gone to work early. All of this led to the arrest of Alita and her boyfriend, the criminal trio, and the battle for the inheritance. Alita was arrested at her mother's house. Her boyfriend was detained a few hours later at an entertainment establishment, and the next morning, Jorge was arrested, betrayed by Fernando, who tried to blame the crime on him. It is noteworthy that it was Gonzalez who first began to testify, hoping that cooperation with the investigation will benefit him and help to mitigate the sentence. Meanwhile, Alejandro hired the best lawyers for his daughter, but realized that she will not be able to escape punishment. At the same time, he began to deal with Vasquez's inheritance, intending to take it for himself. Since the will had disappeared and the heiress was facing a long prison sentence, he claimed that he and Elizabeth had never divorced, but simply lived apart, remaining legally married. Meanwhile, Ernesto Vasquez, Alita's grandfather, decided to visit his favorite granddaughter in prison to look her in the eye, as he could not believe that the girl he had known and raised since infancy could commit such a horrible act. However, Alita behaved arrogantly, shouted, insulted the older man, and stated that she did not wish to see him again. This encounter upset him greatly, leading to a heart attack from which he was unable to recover and died 6 months later. The Vasquez family was unable to prove the existence of the will left in Ernesto's name, as the document disappeared from Elizabeth's office and the notary's database, seemingly taken care of by Alejandro. All documents and references to the couple's divorce also mysteriously disappeared, giving Alejandro the right to claim the deceased's inheritance. The trial and the verdict. Despite attempts by Elita, Fernando, and Jorge to shift the blame onto each other, the investigation successfully reconstructed the events of that fateful evening and established the role of each participant in the crime. It was also proven that the trio acted in a deliberate conspiracy, which greatly aggravated their guilt. A decisive role in the trial was played by the testimony of the maid Maria, who stated that Alejandro had threatened her, demanding that she give a different version of events, but she refused to comply. In May 2012, the court found all three defendants guilty. Initially, the prosecutor had requested that each participant in the murder be sentenced to 30 years imprisonment. While the men pleaded guilty, Elita continually played the victim. Fernando and Jorge were eventually sentenced to 28 years each, but Elita's trial was delayed. Elita claimed that the perpetrators were hired by relatives on her mother's side, who fabricated the inheritance story in order to take possession of Elizabeth's property and money. Her father held the same version of events. Attempts to declare Elita mentally ill and susceptible to manipulation by criminals also failed. This strategy, proposed by Alejandro, was to send her to a psychiatric hospital instead of prison, declaring her insane and incapable of fully and solely inheriting his wife's estate. Finally, in December 2012, the court delivered its final verdict, sentencing Elita to the maximum term of 30 years in prison. To this day, she and her accomplices are serving their sentences in prison. As for the disputed inheritance, its fate remains unresolved. In the spring of 2021, Alejandro died without becoming the only heir. The Vasquez family, through the court, seeks to exclude Elita from the list of claimants to Elizabeth's property, citing the fact that she is in prison for murder. Currently, the main claimant for the inheritance is Maria Movila, Elizabeth's mother. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime, in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital. But despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. She naively believed that this would happen again, and loved ones and colleagues did not even guess that her spouse raised his hand on her. However, a year later, the story repeated itself, and Adrian again beat his wife. This time, Samantha decided that it was the last straw. In addition, her husband's constant temper tantrums and his manic desire to control her every move were driving Samantha crazy. She wrote a statement to the police, reporting that she was beaten by her husband, then took the children and moved to the house of her parents. In the spring of 2017, the spouses officially divorced, and their family home, by court order, got Samantha and the children, and soon they returned there. However, Adrian did not plan to leave his ex-wife alone at all, and continued to pursue her, poisoning her life. The young woman did not feel safe, and was in constant fear. Fearing for her own life and the lives of her children, she obtained a court injunction to prevent her ex-husband from approaching them and trying to interfere in any way in their affairs. But this did not stop Basham. He settled nearby, trying in every way to annoy Samantha. According to a friend of Edrin, he promised to take away from his ex-wife everything that is dear to her, starting from the house and ending with children, as well as openly threatened physical violence against her. Shortly before the tragedy, the man again told his friend that Samantha would soon pay for everything. At the same time, he looked threatening, but the friend did not take these words seriously until he learned of the woman's death. Living in constant fear and nervous tension, Samantha equipped her home with an alarm system, installed bars on her windows, and placed surveillance cameras outside her home. She admitted that she was afraid that her ex-husband might break into her home and harm her or the children in some way. About a year after the divorce, Samantha began to feel that her ex-husband had calmed down and cooled down a bit. He became less frequent in her sight, which gave her the illusion of safety. Samantha even began to have an affair and began to make plans for a new happy life. On July 22, 2018, Fraser celebrated her 38th birthday in the company of close friends and a beloved man named Wayne. According to the memories of those who shared this holiday with her, she looked happy and was quite calm for herself and her loved ones. A few days before, the new chosen one had proposed to the woman, and after the wedding, they planned to take a long vacation and travel to distract themselves and forget about problems. The next morning, Samantha took the children to school and was on her way to work when she received a phone call from someone she knew, warning her that Adrian was in the neighborhood of her home. Samantha was concerned about this, but decided not to panic, just to be more cautious. She was due to face her ex-husband in court in a domestic violence case in a couple weeks, and she feared that he might somehow retaliate against her for the lawsuit. The woman shared her worries with her best friend in a phone conversation, but the latter reassured her. After that conversation, Samantha was never seen alive again. When Samantha did not come to school that day to pick up her children, the teacher, who knew about the difficult situation in their family, decided to call the police. The law enforcers immediately went to their home to check everything, and at first the situation looked as if the mistress had not yet returned. But when the officers of the law decided to check the garage adjacent to the house, before them opened a terrible picture. The body of the 38-year-old homeowner was hanging from the garage door fixture, and on the whole, the picture might have looked like the young woman had taken her own life. But Samantha's appearance was as if she had been run over by a truck. There was literally not a living spot on Samantha, and the hair on her head was wet and falling over her face, covering it. She wasn't wearing the same clothes she had left the house in that morning, and her shoes were missing altogether. It was obvious that someone else had been in the garage, and that someone had tried to make it look like Samantha had voluntarily passed away, but had made a lot of mistakes. For example, there was an overturned stepladder lying next to the body, but the rope was so long that the woman's feet were touching the floor. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward, According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity, during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court. Although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims, he, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment. The tragic story of the Rose family is considered one of the most bizarre and confusing crimes committed in America in recent years. This case struck investigators not only by its cynicism and cruelty, but also by the fact that the victims and the alleged perpetrators were close relatives. Despite the fact that many years have passed since the crime was committed, and the perpetrator has long served his harsh sentence behind bars, there are still many questions and white spots in this story. Many still do not believe in the fairness of the court's verdict. Now let's get down to business. It was an ordinary average family living in a provincial suburb of Bristol in the state of Tennessee and had never been on the radar of law enforcers before. The family was headed by elderly couple Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, who had lived together for over 40 years. They had 2 grown daughters and 6 grandchildren, but we will only look at those family members who were directly involved in this high-profile case. So, at the time of the crime in the house and the surrounding area were the elderly owners themselves, Curtis and Lena Maria Rose, their eldest daughter, 39-year-old Tosha Milhorn with her husband James, and 6 children. 2 of the children were Tosha and James's shared children, while the other 3 children were their heirs from a previous relationship. Also present in the house was a neighborhood girl who stopped by to play with them. It is worth noting that Tosha and James and their children lived at Tosha's parents' house for about 2 months, as their own home was undergoing renovations at the time. Later, another key player in those events, 19-year-old Seth Denton, arrived at the house. He was Toshi's eldest son, but his relationship with his mother and stepfather was strained, to put it mildly, and they avoided communicating with each other in every possible way, and their last meeting ended in tragedy. According to neighbors, the Rose couple was quite happy and prosperous. Their daughter Tosha was also happily married to James, who worked as an auto mechanic and was fond of restoring vintage cars. It was the Rose couple's family home that was the scene of the carnage. Police officers who arrived on the call later dubbed it the worst crime scene they had ever seen and the bloodiest in the history of their quiet county. The bodies of 2 women, Lena Maria and Tosha, a mother and daughter, were found in the house, shot almost point blank. Tosha was in a chair at the dining room table, and her mother was lying on the floor between the table and the refrigerator. Also lying on the doorstep of the house was the critically wounded James, Tosha's husband, who was quickly rushed to the hospital. But despite the efforts of the doctors, the man soon died of extensive internal injuries and massive blood loss. None of the children in the house were injured. It is likely that they were not targeted by the shooter, or were simply not in his field of vision at the time of the massacre of the adults. Almost immediately after the crime, the police received 2 phone calls, one after the other. The first call came from the owner of the house, Curtis Rose, who said that his eldest grandson Seth had committed a shooting in the house and then fled the scene. But soon there was a call from Seth himself, who told a different version of what happened and blamed everything on his grandfather Curtis. In addition, it turned out that Seth was wounded in the arm and shot him, Curtis. However, he did not deny it, saying that he was trying to detain his grandson and not let him escape from the scene of the massacre. The alleged killer, Seth Denton, was arrested in the hospital, where he sought medical help in connection with the wound. Then the investigation was to restore the chain of tragic events and find out what really happened in the house of the Rose family. Surprisingly, but for the basis of the investigation was taken only one version, and the second version was taken seriously only a few years later. On August 29, 2015, around 6 o'clock in the evening, residents of houses located near the scene of the crime heard a series of gunshots. No one paid much attention to it, as there were forests around, where hunting of wild animals and birds was allowed. Later, one of the neighbors noted that he was a little alarmed by the number of shots, and then the silence, but he did not consider it a good reason to call the police. Another neighbor testified at trial that in addition to the gunshots, he heard screaming and went out on the porch of his house to see what was going on. At that point, he saw a young man running down the path from the neighbor's house to a car parked by the road. He was being chased by another man, but because of the trees by the road, the witness had a poor view of what was happening. He only saw the guy jump into the vehicle, then 2 shots rang out, and then the car sped off. Just a few minutes later, neighbors heard the howling of sirens and saw police cars and emergency vehicles starting to arrive at Rose's house, and soon an air ambulance helicopter landed on the lawn outside the house, arriving to pick up James, who was still alive. Everything that was happening resembled the shooting of some movie, and none of the eyewitnesses did not understand what happened. Arriving police officers were met by the elderly owner of the house, who was holding a firearm, and another gun belonging to him was later found in his bedroom. Curtis told his version of events, which was taken as the basis of the investigation and was long believed to be the only one. According to Curtis, there was nothing to portend trouble that day. In his and his wife's house visited his daughter with his son-in-law and grandchildren, as well as a neighbor's child who came to play. He himself was tinkering in his trailer in the backyard of the house. He heard the sounds of gunshots, but like most neighbors, he didn't pay much attention to it, thinking it was hunters in the woods. Suddenly, his oldest grandson, Seth, appeared at the trailer, arriving unannounced and looking very excited. The young man said there had been some kind of tragedy and asked him to call emergency services immediately. Curtis followed his grandson into the house, where he immediately came across the dead bodies of his wife and daughter. Curtis immediately thought of the children in the house. They were in the other room, frightened, but none of them were hurt. He took them to the back of the house and locked them up so they wouldn't see the horror that was going on in the house. While Curtis was calling emergency services, he saw his grandson hurriedly leaving the house and running toward the road. The homeowner drew his gun and began to chase Seth, believing that he was the killer. As Seth jumped into the car, Grandpa fired 2 shots. One bullet shattered the rear window without hitting the driver, and the second bullet hit Seth in the left shoulder. Despite the injury, he managed to get away, but after reaching the nearest house, Seth stopped to call the police and report what had happened. The local sheriff who was investigating was puzzled. The picture of the crime looked so strange and illogical that similar cases simply did not exist in his memory. In a breaking news report, he said that the investigators had a difficult job ahead of them to reconstruct the whole picture of the crime. After the arrest of Seth Denton, It was necessary to establish the motive why the young man had treated his family members so cruelly, and most surprisingly, such a motive was quickly found. Seth was the eldest child of his mother Toshi, whom she had given birth to in her early youth. Her relationship with the boy's father did not work out, and her son's upbringing was mostly handled by his grandparents, while the young woman settled her personal life. Also, according to some reports, Tosha suffered from bipolar affective disorder and periodically went to the clinic. Most likely, her son could also inherit this disease. Since childhood, the boy had a strong resentment towards his mother, whom he hardly ever saw. With age, this feeling turned into hatred, about which Seth often told friends and relatives. After graduating from school, the guy decided to go to serve in the army, and a year later, returning home, he again settled at his grandparents'. However, soon the young man decided that he wanted to start an independent life and moved to the city, where he rented a small apartment with his friend. He got a job at one of the local fast food restaurants, but shortly before the tragedy, the guy was fired. Family and friends spoke positively about Seth, noting that he never had any violent tendencies, did not run with bad companies, and never broke the law. But despite the positive characteristics, detectives considered that the main motive of the crime was Seth's unpleasant feelings towards his mother and her current spouse. According to the investigation, the events of that day developed as follows. Around 5 p.m., Seth drove his car to the house of his grandparents. He was wearing a camouflage jacket, and in the car lay a semi-automatic rifle. He left the car by the roadside, and with the weapon in hand, he went to the house, entering through the back door. Seth then fired several shots, killing his mother, grandmother, and severely wounding his stepfather, before leaving the jacket and rifle by the back door and going to his grandfather's house and asking him to call the police. The order in which the shots were fired was never determined because Seth completely denied his guilt. In addition, it was unclear why he asked his grandfather to call the police rather than fleeing immediately from the scene of the crime. It is assumed that his main target were his mother and stepfather, and the guy killed his grandmother as an unnecessary witness. As the main evidence proving Seth's guilt, the case included his jacket and rifle, found on the threshold at the back door of the house, traces of blood on his shoes, as well as bullets found in his car. Remarkably, about 100 rounds of ammunition in total were found, but no one questioned why he needed so many if he only planned to kill 2 people. Another oddity was the timing. According to the grandfather, after he and his grandson entered the house, where the terrible picture opened before his eyes, Seth hurriedly left the scene. Curtis himself found and took the children to safety, called the police, pulled out the gun he kept, and after all this, managed to catch up with his grandson and shot him twice. It was not until 2016 that the young man presented his version of what happened in court, which no one had previously considered for some reason. According to Seth, he has always been very close to his grandparents who raised him, but meetings with his mother he avoided by all means. As a teenager, he often went to shooting ranges with his grandfather, and it was his grandfather who encouraged him to join the army. On that fateful day, Seth called his maternal aunt Amanda, his mother's younger sister, and said he was going to visit his grandparents but didn't want to meet his mother there. The woman did not know that Tosha and her husband were visiting her parents, so she assured Seth that he could go without fear of crossing paths with his mother and stepfather. Amanda confirmed that information in court, noting that her nephew couldn't have known that Tosha and James were at Rose's house. Seth had hoped that he and his grandfather would go to the shooting range, and that was the reason he had brought a rifle with so many rounds of ammunition. He drove up to the house, got the gun, and went straight to the trailer where Grandpa usually worked. There, his grandson showed him his rifle, and they had a little discussion about it. Curtis then headed for the house without letting go of the rifle, and his grandson followed him. Seth knew that his grandfather had a gun and expected him to follow him, and afterward they would shoot targets together. However, when Curtis entered the room, he immediately opened fire, and the people in the room did not even have time to realize anything. and did not try to run away or hide. According to Seth's lawyers, Curtis may have had a temporary insanity during which he killed members of his family. But this version seemed untenable, so it was not considered initially and marked in court. Although on the clothes and shoes of an elderly man also had traces of blood of the victims, he, for some reason from the very beginning, was not even included in the number of suspects. The young man in the dock was facing the capital punishment of death for the premeditated triple murder of his family members. His grandfather had been a key witness in the case from the beginning, and despite the fact that he had openly stated that he was prepared to kill his grandson that day, the court found such behavior justified. Curtis Rose was not taken to the station or questioned as a suspect, and his version of the events of that day was accepted as the only true one. In addition, many details and inconsistencies were simply overlooked, and Seth's version was not even considered until a year and a half after the crime. Most of the physical evidence did confirm Curtis's words, but what was out of the picture was somehow ignored by the investigation. The main argument in court was that Mr. Rose had no obvious motive for killing his wife, daughter, and son-in-law. The version of temporary insanity seemed far-fetched and untenable. The trial lasted more than a week, during which time nearly 200 pieces of evidence were presented and dozens of witnesses, including neighbors, relatives, and family friends, were heard. The grandfather and grandson's testimony completely contradicted each other, and it was obvious that one of them was lying. The jury deliberated for several days. They admitted to being severely exhausted emotionally and physically, but when it came to a verdict, they unanimously stated that they had no doubt that the defendant was guilty of each of the counts charged. Thus, Seth Denton was found guilty of triple murder, but after a detailed review of all the evidence and circumstances of the tragedy, the court decided to exclude the death penalty from the possible punishments, changing the sentence to life imprisonment without the right to parole, at least the next 50 years. The convict himself never admitted his guilt. He is currently serving his sentence in a Tennessee prison. As for the orphaned children of Tosha and James Milhorn, they were left in the care of other family members, including their Aunt Amanda and grandfather Curtis. Today we're heading to San Antonio, Texas, a city near the Mexican border that stands out for its incredible cultural diversity and tradition blending. This border location plays a crucial role, offering a slice of home for Mexicans. The name San Antonio itself, derived from Mexico's national language, Spanish translates to Saint Anthony, which is quite fitting for the city. A highlight of San Antonio is the Trinity University College of Arts and Sciences, particularly the Murchison Tower. Standing at 166 feet, it was once the tallest structure in the city. One day, a young man walked into the university campus. He made his way to a women's dormitory on the second floor, found a specific room, and forcibly entered by breaking the door handle, wreaking havoc inside. With furious anger, he scattered clothes around the room, broke furniture, and tore apart books and notebooks on the desk. His rage was uncontrollable, and by the time security arrived due to the noise, he was sitting on the bed crying, a spilled soda in his hand. The young man was arrested and taken to the police station. The damage inflicted on the room and the university was assessed at $650. The individual apprehended was 22-year-old Mark Howerton. Recently, he had lost his beloved girlfriend Kaylee and was struggling to cope with his loss. He went to her room and couldn't manage his emotions. During his arrest, he cried incessantly, repeatedly calling out Kaylee's name. 4 months prior to this incident, Mark Howerton was charged in connection with the demise of his girlfriend and Trinity University cheerleader, Kaylee Mandadi. This story is riddled with rumors, questions, and an abundance of information from law enforcement agencies. But let's take it from the top. Kaylee Anita Mandadi was born on August 26, 1998, in Webster, to Tilak Mandadi and Allison Steele. The family was well off. Allison was a scientist, and Tilak worked as an international executive director at MGM Resorts. After her parents divorced, Allison remarried NASA engineer Lawrence Butlin, who lived in Houston, when Kaylee was 9. Despite her parents' separation, Kaylee maintained a strong relationship with her father, regularly communicating with him. Her stepfather also adored Kaylee and became a second dad to her. Kaylee was not just a grateful and loving daughter and granddaughter, but also an excellent student, team member, sister, and friend whose infectious laughter and kind heart could light up any rules. In school, Kaylee excelled academically and participated in all extracurricular activities. She enjoyed horseback riding, played the piano, and even performed in theater. Kaylee was a Girl Scout, ran around the Clear Lake neighborhood with her friends, and went on hikes with her parents. In 2016, she graduated with honors from Clear Creek High School in League City, Texas. Kaylee loved animals and joyfully participated in a volunteer group called Animal Therapy. She was always eager to explore new and uncharted territories, dreamed of trying extreme sports, and was constantly in search of thrilling experiences. At 19, the slender, dark-haired Kaylee was already a sophomore at Trinity University in San Antonio, where she was studying communications. She was well-liked with many friends and led the football team's cheerleading squad. Her vibrant and radiant beauty attracted many admirers. One day during a football game where she was cheering for the Trinity team, she met 22-year-old Mark Howerton. The tall, bright athlete and professional baseball player failed to catch Kaylee's eye at first, since she was smitten with Jet and paid no attention to anyone else. But Mark fell for her at first sight, captivated by her large black eyes and the charisma that set her apart from the rest of the cheer squad. Their first meeting didn't go well, nor did their second. However, Mark persisted, and by September 2017, they officially started dating. From the beginning, their friends and acquaintances deemed them an ill-matched pair, as both were too emotional and quick-tempered. Their relationship lacked compromise, marked from the start by tumultuous arguments and confrontations. The young, passionate couple was constantly jealous and quarreled often. Friends who observed their relationship reported that Kaylee frequently had bruises on her arms and legs. A close friend also shared about an incident that deeply frightened her. Kaylee once asked her to retrieve her mobile phone from Mark because she was too scared to do it herself. The situation escalated to the point where Mark became aggressive, brandishing a gun and threatening violence. Kaylee was aware of her boyfriend's jealousy and temper, but always reassured her friends and asked them not to publicize their loud arguments, since she admitted she wasn't entirely innocent either. However, around 1 a.m. on September 24, 2017, Kaylee's roommates couldn't stand it anymore and called the police. They heard loud noises coming from Kaylee's room and a man yelling and threatening violence. The responding officer found Mark alone in the room. Kaylee declined to press charges, stating nothing had happened and it was just a lover's quarrel. But her friends believed Mark was using controlled substances, leading to uncontrollable outbursts of anger. He once threatened to throw Kaylee off a balcony. Her friends reported this to the police as well. Their relationship was like an ocean. During a storm, the waves were tumultuous, but in calm weather, they were blissfully in love. On October 29th, Mark and Kaylee went to the Malaluna Music Festival in San Antonio. It's one of the largest music festivals focusing on Gothic, modern industrial, and dark wave music, attracting over 10,000 people annually. Malaluna is a hotspot for partygoers and those seeking solitude, as it's easy to blend into the crowd and disappear within its bounds. Mark and Kaylee had a great time partying with their friends throughout the evening. However, the unexpected arrival of Kaylee's ex once again drove Mark to the edge. They had a major argument and left the festival early. That was the last time their friends saw them that night. 6 hours later, deep into the night, Mark's black Mercedes pulled up at a hospital. He rushed out of the car, desperately waving and calling for help. The medical staff found a semi-nude girl in the front seat, unconscious. The car was in disarray. Kaylee's clothes were scattered about. and she sat slumped forward like a lifeless doll. Kaylee was moved onto a stretcher and taken to the emergency room. Mark informed the hospital staff that they had consumed illegal substances prior to attending the festival. This information aided doctors in treating her for a potential overdose. She was then transferred to another medical facility in Kyle, Texas, where a nurse specialized in intimate assault cases examined her and discovered additional bruises on her arms, legs, and ear. A forensic examination determined that blunt force trauma to the face and head was the cause of demise, indicating Kaylee had been the victim of a fatal assault. Consequently, police initiated an investigation to find the individual responsible for Kaylee Mandadi's loss of life. Mark was the primary suspect since he was the last person seen with Kaylee that night, yet there were no concrete pieces of evidence linking him to the crime. However, Mark cast suspicion on himself. With each subsequent police interview, he altered his account of events, drawing investigators' attention. Surveillance footage captured him and Kaylee in locations Mark had failed to mention. Furthermore, conversations with Kaylee's friends and family members revealed his tendency towards aggressive behavior towards her. One of her sisters even expressed being terrified of him. The police uncovered alleged incidents of violence between the couple, including Mark hitting Kaylee's head against a car window and trashing her dorm room at Trinity. Upon learning about Mark's previous assaults on Kaylee at the university, her parents were devastated. The mother of the slain Trinity University cheerleader, Kaylee Mandadi, filed a lawsuit against the institution, alleging it failed to take necessary steps to protect her daughter from her boyfriend's attacks, who is accused of causing her demise in a fit of jealousy. The lawsuit was filed in the Bexar County District Court on behalf of the mother, Allison Steele. The former boyfriend of her daughter, Mark Howerton, is also named as a defendant. The suit claims that Howerton assaulted the 19-year-old from League City and was ultimately responsible for her fatality. According to the lawsuit, Trinity staff, its administration, and campus police were aware of Mark Howerton's erratic behavior during their relationship. It alleges that the man threatened to break Kaylee Mandadi's face or inflict serious bodily harm. But the university took no action in the weeks leading up to her demise to protect the young woman. A spokesperson for Trinity University declined to comment on the lawsuit's allegations, citing the ongoing legal process. Trinity University's failure to respond to numerous reports of harassment, cruel treatment, intimidation, domestic violence, and gender discrimination led to the tragic end of the sophomore. Allison Steele's statement also mentioned that Kaylee Mandadi's tragedy could have been prevented had Trinity intervened as it should have. The university ignored its own policy on investigating and responding to potential cases of violence and harassment in relationships, as stated in the lawsuit. After an incident in the dorm room, Mark was issued a criminal trespass order, banning him from the campus for a year, yet he repeatedly violated it. Additionally, detectives discovered many stories of Mark's violent behavior towards Kaylee during their relationship. For instance, one of her sisters recounted that he threatened to throw her off a balcony during an argument, while another claimed he also threatened to shoot some of her ex-boyfriend's brothers with his gun. Based on all these statements against him, the police were able to issue a warrant for his arrest, after which he turned himself in. In February 2018, following the discovery of Kaylee's room in disarray at the university, Mark Howerton surrendered to the police. He faced multiple charges including criminal acts, intimate violence, and abduction. However, he pleaded not guilty to these charges. The first trial regarding Kaylee Mandadi's demise began in December 2019. Prosecutors argued that Mark, known for his volatile temperament, fatally assaulted Kaylee Mandadi in a fit of rage. They also claimed that he transported her for nearly 6 hours before taking her to the hospital. In defense, Mark's legal team contended that Kaylee's end could be attributed to various factors. Autopsy reports revealed the presence of banned substances in her system, suggesting a potential spike in blood pressure or head trauma during intimate activity. Kaylee's mother recounted that the injuries and bruises on her daughter's body were severe, akin to falling from an airplane. Indeed, the injuries were extensive. Photos presented to the jurors of Bexar County showed the Trinity University sophomore from San Antonio, Texas, barely recognizable with bruises from head to toe, red marks and scratches. Both of her eyelids were swollen and bruised. The only areas without any sign of injury were her back and the back of her legs. Graphics and photographs taken by Dr. Susanna Dana, the forensic pathologist who conducted Kaylee Mandadi's autopsy, showed a subdural hematoma, a collection of blood usually associated with traumatic brain injury on the right side of her brain. Kaylee's father, Tilak Mandadi, after seeing 2 photos where the victim was in the ICU in a vegetative state, surrounded by numerous tubes with her face hardly visible, spoke about his daughter with a trembling voice as tears filled his eyes. "That's my daughter," he said, "my only child." Dr. Susanna Dana stated that upon examining Mandadi's head, she found a dent in her skull. Most of the doctor's testimonies focused on the cranial and facial injuries Mandadi suffered, which Dana described as severe injuries. These injuries included eye trauma. Both eyelids were bruised, with the left eyelid so swollen it couldn't fully close. There were extensive bruises on both the left and right jaws, bruises on the inside of the mouth, above the teeth on the gums, on the lips and cheeks. There were hemorrhages in both eyes, she said, showing photos of the inner eyelid lining. She concluded that the cause of Mandadi's demise was a blunt object's head and facial trauma. Dr. William Anderson reviewed the autopsy results and disagreed with the conclusions that Kaylee Mandadi had been attacked. "We don't see any fractures in the orbit. No fractures in the nose either. We don't see any fractures on the face. This indicates that there was no frontal assault. Instead, Anderson suggested that the young woman's injuries were more consistent with a fall and extensive medical intervention." Defense attorney John Hunter presented an alternative narrative, stating that the prosecution lacked sufficient evidence to clarify what happened to Kaylee Mandadi that night. Proving Mark Howerton's involvement in the incident was deemed impossible. Throughout the trial, he frequently pointed to Kaylee Mandadi's drug use, at one point referencing her treatment for substance dependence at a hospital. Jason Wallach, a professor at the University of Sciences in Philadelphia, testified that Kaylee Mandadi had a high level of MDMA, commonly known as ecstasy or Molly, in her blood after her boyfriend took her to the hospital on the evening of October 29, 2017. The presence of these substances indicated that a person could sustain a minor head injury, and the effects of MDMA could turn it fatal. John Hunter, building on the above conclusions, suggested that the drug affects each person differently. Many people experience an increase in body temperature or an electrolyte imbalance when taking the substance. According to him, these conditions could lead to a loss of consciousness. The jury began to hear testimonies. That day, jurors saw a video and heard an audio recording from police officers, where Mark Howerton told investigators that he and Kaylee had an argument and engaged in intimate relations in the car before she passed out, and that they enjoyed engaging in rough intimacy. He stated he would strangle her during the act because she liked it. Mark Howerton claimed that everything was consensual, but where did these bruises come from and when? This question remained unresolved during the trial concerning Kaylee's demise in December 2019. Allison firmly believed that Mark Howerton would be held responsible for her daughter's end. However, after the 2019 trial, the family felt deeply disappointed. Although Mark was charged with ending a life, he maintained his innocence. The defense argued that the victim's injuries were inflicted during resuscitation efforts by hospital staff. As a result, the jury could not reach a verdict, leading to a mistrial. The case was heard in the 144th District Court of the state, presided over by Judge Raymond Angelini. When the jury could not reach a verdict, the case was declared a mistrial and dismissed. Thus, in the first trial, Howerton was acquitted of the charges, leaving the case unresolved. Bexar County District Attorney Joe Gonzalez, who had been handling the case from the beginning, expressed his disappointment with the outcome. and stated that he would review the case. During this time, Kaylee Mandadi's parents decided to start their investigation. They collected all evidence and autopsy reports from the police and focused on a small, round, pinpoint bruise near Kaylee's ear. Allison and Lawrence speculated that Mark might have hit her head against the car window, causing her to hit the door lock and get bruised. They hoped this would establish his guilt. Identifying a similar Mercedes, the car Mark was driving that night, Lawrence took photos, posing in a manner they believed reflected the circumstances under which Kaylee might have injured her head. With the assistance of Texas Rangers, they obtained records, 3 written affidavits under oath, in the warrant for Howerton's arrest on charges of criminal acts, aggravated intimate assault, and criminal mischief, addressing many questions about Mandadi's case and providing a detailed timeline of events before and after her demise. The slideshow listed key moments in chronological order leading to Kaylee's death and the evidence found during the investigation. Specifically, the timeline provided by authorities sheds light on Mark Howerton's alleged falsehoods to the Rangers and the evidence that led to his arrest. Throughout the trial, prosecutors portrayed Howerton as a manipulative and controlling boyfriend who constantly called Kaylee and took her phone away so she couldn't talk to friends. At one point, 2 weeks before her demise, Howerton pushed Mandadi against a brick wall and in a fit of rage trashed her dorm room. Soon after, Kaylee told Mark that she needed space, according to texts reviewed by the jury. Howerton began sending her dozens of messages, at one point threatening to end his life. She pleaded with him not to do so. In total, he called her about 200 times that evening. Then, they attended a festival and argued over Kaylee's ex-boyfriend, who was also there. Mark Howerton took Kaylee Mandadi from the festival, placed her in the car, and drove to a deserted parking lot near the Whataburger headquarters, close to US 281 and Sunset Road. GPS camera records show that the couple was in the parking lot for over an hour. Prosecutors suggested that it was there Mark Howerton attacked Kaylee Mandadi and beat her to death. Kaylee Mandadi's family thanked the Texas Rangers for their diligent work in bringing the appropriate criminal charges against Kaylee's alleged assailant. The retrial for Mark Howerton commenced in June 2023 after delays due to the COVID-19 pandemic. At the trial, the prosecution considered presenting a video recorded by Kaylee Mandadi's parents capturing her injuries in the hospital, but ultimately withdrew it due to potential complications and new disputes. Evidence collected with the help of Texas Rangers was also taken into account. Mark Howerton was found guilty of aggravated assault causing bodily harm, leading to legal case. The court sentenced him to 20 years in prison, with a $10,000 fine and restitution to Kaylee Mandadi's family. Additionally, he was barred from contacting over 20 individuals involved in the case. Mark, now over 30 years old, is serving his sentence in the Willacy County Jail, eligible for parole in 2033. The conviction brought some closure to Kaylee's family, though they stated the sentence seemed insufficient for their loss. In the second trial, Mark Howerton faced charges including aggravated assault, causing serious bodily harm, in addition to the initial charge of manslaughter from the first trial. Unlike the first trial, the prosecution expanded the charges to include aggravated assault and criminally negligent homicide. The legal strategy was adjusted to present a more comprehensive case against Mark Howerton. However, dissatisfied with the outcome, Kaylee's family and prosecutors insisted on a retrial. Kaylee Mandadi's tragic story highlighted the devastating impact of violence on a young life and her grieving family's quest for justice. This complex case is the focus of the article The Final Hours of Kaylee Mandadi, reported by 48 Hours correspondent Peter Van Sant. Kaylee Mandadi's story serves as a stark reminder of the consequences of violence against young people with promising futures. Despite the conviction, Kaylee's family stated that the verdict does not serve justice for their beloved daughter. In 2019, Allison Steele, Kaylee Mandadi's mother, successfully lobbied the Texas legislature to expand the missing persons alert system in Texas. She then founded the nonprofit organization Kaylee's Calling, aiming to consolidate missing persons alert systems. Steele also established a nonprofit dedicated to providing public information about the Clear Alert, an emergency broadcasting alert in Texas for individuals aged 18 to 64. In addition to these efforts, in 2021, she filed a civil lawsuit against Trinity University alleging negligence in protecting her daughter. Steele claimed that none of Kaylee's guardians were informed that Mark Howerton had trashed her dorm room. She also stated that the university took no action against him, allegedly giving him continuous access to her daughter and making her vulnerable to manipulation. It remains unclear whether the evidence collected by Allison and Lawrence was presented at Mark Howerton's trial in 2023. Despite being acquitted of the charge of ending a life, he was found guilty of aggravated assault causing bodily harm. Prosecutors noted that the family expressed satisfaction with the verdict, as they had endured prolonged suffering and felt relief that the legal proceedings had concluded, allowing them to begin the healing process. Losing a child is an agonizing ordeal, and sadly, it was a heart-wrenching journey that Kaylee Mandadi's parents had to endure. Allison Steele said they are still completely devastated by the loss of Kaylee and ask those of faith to pray for her family, friends, and for justice in this matter.